Well, I hope you're as excited for part two of the Maimonidean controversy video as I am. In part one, we talked about the Maimonides part of the Maimonidean controversy. Specifically, we talked about how the Rambam was such a giant figure in terms of Torah knowledge and worldly knowledge as well. Um, and we talked about all the amazing things that he did in his life, how he was a doctor, how he was a community leader, how he published a tremendous amount of Torah works and of works on philosophy. Um, while no one could deny that the Rambam was a major scholar and a super genius, some people challenged his religious beliefs. They didn't like certain things about his approach to Judaism, and as you might have guessed, those people came not from Spain or from other Muslim countries or countries under Muslim rule, but they came from Ashkenaz. They came from the Jewish, the Jews who lived in the communities mainly in France and in Germany. So let's talk now about what the Maimonidean controversy was all about. So there are a couple of main issues that the opponents to the Rambam took, and here are the main ones. So first of all, the Rambam is known as a rationalist, and what that means is that his thought is governed by reason as much as to a great degree, as opposed to people who are less rational or more willing to rely on or to accept things that might not be so logical, and especially in discussions when it comes to religion, things like miracles. So the Rambam was, for example, the Rambam, while he believed in the Torah, and he believed that the Torah was true, he did sometimes try to downplay, miracles, while if he could explain them as natural occurrences, he would. And while, again, like I said, he believes that God makes miracles and made miracles, like things like the splitting of the sea and the Makot, for example, the Rambam believes that God tries to do, or God created the world with this rule of nature, and he prefers not to break the rules of nature because he created those rules for a reason, and so breaking those rules all the time to do miracles doesn't really make sense. So he believes in some miracles, but to a limited degree. He also tries to explain those miracles. When miracles can be explained in a natural way, he will try to do that. He also believes that God cannot be physical, and this is based on his philosophical approach. If God is physical, then therefore he's limited, right? If anything that is physical has limits, right? So even if someone's really tall, so you can have someone who's 7.5 feet tall, they're really tall, but they're only that tall, meaning they're not any taller than that. If something is, you could say the world is huge, but the world is only as big as it is and no bigger than that. So anything that you put a physical measurement on, you're by definition limiting it. And since God can't be limited, God is perfect and God is infinite, therefore he can't be physical, because if he were physical, then he would be limited. So the Rambam does not believe that God could possibly be physical, and because of that, that leads to interpreting certain psukim in the Torah, certain verses, as non-literally, because the Torah says things like, God will take the Jewish people out of Mitzrayim biyad chazaka uvizroa netuya, with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. Well, if God doesn't actually have a hand or an arm, so then how do you understand those psukim? So the Rambam had no problem saying that's a metaphor. People, understand those types of phrases. Human beings speak that way, so it's fine if the Torah would speak that way as well. But other people had major issues with saying that. How could you say that the Torah is not literal? Every single word of the Torah is true. If the Torah says God has yad chazakah, so then God really has a hand. If the Torah says, the Rambam also thinks things like anger, that God doesn't actually get angry. It's just that the Torah speaks in a way that human beings can understand. Human beings understand emotions like anger. The Rambam says, what are you talking about? Anger is a human emotion. It's imperfect. It's it's a reaction. We get upset, we get angry, and then we do things sometimes that we regret. When the Torah says that God got angry, it's the Torah's way of saying that God did not approve of something that the Jewish people did, for example. But God can't have emotions like that. God can't have physical limitations like that. So if you accept that belief, then what you have to do is you have to interpret psukim in the Torah as saying this is a metaphor, this isn't literal. Well, the Rambam didn't think that was a problem at all. because he thought the Torah was just talking in a way that people could understand. The Rambam's opponents had a huge problem with that. How dare you say that any word in the Torah is not meant exactly as it says? This is what God says. This is exactly what it meant, and how could you say anything differently? So that was a major issue. So far, we talked about how the Rambam didn't think that God could be physical because he was such a rationalist, and certain of his rationalist beliefs caused his opponents to take issue. We also talked about how the Rambam didn't believe that every single word in the Torah is literal. Some words are actually metaphorical, and his opponents, like we said, thought that that was heretical, thought that that was an unacceptable belief. Another issue that people had was the Rambam's oversimplifying of Jewish law and Jewish beliefs. So, for example, we talked in the previous video, we talked about the Mishnah Torah. So the Mishnah Torah is a halachic work. Now, the way that the Mishnah Torah is created is that it's a really convenient, really helpful source, because if you want to find a law about Shabbat in the Gemara, if you open up good luck finding it in Masechet Shabbat. Basically, you'll have to flip through a long, many pages of Masechet Shabbat that is just a flowing discussion of rabbis commenting on the Mishnah. It's not in any clear order on what it addresses, and in the end, the halacha that you're looking for might not actually end up being in Masechet Shabbat. It might end up being in Masechet Psachim or in Masechet Bava Kama or something like that. It's not, the Gemara is just not organized in a way that you can just go and find something. It's not like an encyclopedia. So the Rambam did in his Mishnah Torah was very helpful. He organized it actually in that each section, each book, each topic, and in order of halachot. So if you want to find something in Hilchot Shabbat, you have to look through the Rambam. The Rambam tells you at the beginning of each book and the beginning of each chapter what he's going to discuss. So it's very helpful. And you don't have to be a Talmid Chacham really to understand the Rambam and the Mishnah Torah. It's written in a pretty simple Hebrew, and you don't have to understand the logic of the background, the machloket of Abaye and Rava or Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael. You don't have to understand all that. You just see the Rambam wrote in simple Hebrew, this is the halacha. Fine, great, very helpful. Problem with that was the Rambam cut out thousands of pages of discussions. How dare the Rambam just decide, okay, this is the halacha in that situation? How dare the Rambam just get rid of all the logic behind it and say, oh, this is the halacha here? People were very against that. That's not the way halacha had been learned for many years, and that's not the way it should be. How could the Rambam change that? He was making this huge change, and people took major issue with that. They didn't like that at all. They felt that just cutting out all the discussions, that undermines the authority of the rabbis too. We rely on the rabbis to get us to the halachic point. The Rambam didn't quote Rabbi Akiva says this, Rabbi Yishmael says this, Rabbi Meir says this, Abaye says this, Rava said, he didn't say any of that. He just says the halacha in this situation is this, the halacha in this situation is that. And people thought that would kind of make it seem like the whole discussion of the rabbis wasn't important. You don't need to spend time learning Gemara, because if you just have the Rambam, then that's all you're going to do. And people thought, while it would be wonderful if today, people spent lots and lots of time learning the Rambam. The rabbis back then thought that was a problem, because instead of learning the Gemara, they were going to be learning the Rambam. They didn't think that was a good thing. In addition, the Rambam also, as we talked about, the Rambam was a major philosopher. So the Rambam decided, hey, look, there's certain things that a Jew needs to believe, right? A Jew needs to believe that Hashem Echad. A Jew needs to believe that the Jewish people were given the Torah at Har Sinai. A Jew needs to believe that there's Mashiach, and Mashiach has yet to come, but Mashiach is going to come. Right? These are things that a Jew needs to believe, right? The Rambam said the beliefs of a Jew should be organized. No one has ever made a clear list of what a Jew needs to believe and has organized it in a clear fashion. So the Rambam says, you know what, I'm going to do that. So in his commentary to Masechet Sanhedrin, in his Perush HaMishnah in Masechet Sanhedrin, the Rambam lays out the Yud Gimel Ikarei Emunah, the 13 fundamental principles of faith. Now, we have songs about those Ani Mamins, and that's a wonderful thing, and the Jewish community is basically, clearly you can tell, has pretty much accepted, or at least taken a liking to these Yud Gimel Ikarei Emunah. However, at the time, many opponents of the Rambam did not like this at all. How dare you say that a person who believes this is a good Jew, but a person who doesn't believe that it's not a good Jew? Who do you think you are? Who are you to say that? There are people that the Rambam says, if you believe that God has a body, then you're an apikoros, then you're a non-believer. Well, people came along and said, what are you talking about? There are great rabbis that believe that God has some kind of physical form. Just because you, Rambam, don't think that doesn't mean that you get to say that everyone who believes that is wrong, right? So they didn't like that the Rambam made this list of, you're in, if you believe this, then you're in. If you don't believe these things, then you're out. They did not like that the Rambam made that list, and that was another thing. So we talked about his rationalism. We talked about his not believing that the Torah was always literal because of physical descriptions of God and therefore interpreting it as a metaphor. We talked about oversimplifying halachic text in the Mishnah Torah and cutting out the Gemara discussion, and we talked about the Yud Gimel Ikari Emunah. Another thing that the opponents of the Rambam found disturbing was that he based a lot of his thought and his writing style on Greek philosophy. And they felt that how could you have this influence of the Greeks in your Torah learning? That's completely inappropriate. That's not acceptable. Torah is Torah, and you should not be bringing in Greek thinking style and Greek writing style into your thought. So as we talked about many times, we have to consider where the two sides are coming from. So like I mentioned, the Rambam lived under Muslim rule for his entire life. He lived in Spain, then he went to and then he lived most of his life in Egypt. For the rest of his life, he lived in Egypt. So he lived under Muslim rule for his entire life. Whereas the opponents of the Rambam, they lived in the Ashkenazi Jews lived under Christian rule. So we talked about how those two communities were kind of different. We talked about how the Jews in the Sephardi world, for the most part, engaged in the world around them. They studied Greek philosophy and other types of secular things. They believed in a broader focus in Jewish learning as well. They believed in studying Tanakh. I'm sorry, the Ashkenazi Jews also believed in studying Tanakh. They believed in studying Jewish philosophy, not just halacha and Tanakh. Of course, we have Rashi and we have other Ashkenazim who write on the Tanakh. But they believed in not just studying Tanakh and halacha, but you should also study Jewish philosophy as well, where that was not as much of a focus in Ashkenaz. In Ashkenaz, the world around them was so harsh, was so evil to them, and they didn't want to have anything to do with that world. They did not think that the world of secular learning, for the most part, had much to offer them. They wanted to study Torah and Torah only, and especially mainly focus on halacha, and not as much on a broader type of learning like Jewish philosophy and things like that. So based on the disagreements that these people had with the Rambam, some French rabbis decided to ban copies of certain sections of the Mishnah Torah, the sections that they thought were inappropriate. They also banned the Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam's philosophical work. In the 1200s, a little after the Rambam died, what happened was a group of Catholic priests, the Dominican priests, burned copies of the Moreh Nevuchim. They heard that there were bad things, bad philosophies in the Moreh Nevuchim, so they burned copies of the Moreh Nevuchim. And so the opponents of the Rambam, while they didn't themselves burn this, and they said that they were, they didn't think that it was appropriate to burn. They did not they didn't fight the Catholics, although maybe it wouldn't be a good idea to fight against them. But anyway. But anyway, a few years later, after the Dominicans burned the copies of the Talmud, after the Dominicans burned the copies of the Moreh Nevuchim, they went ahead and they burned copies of the Moreh Nevuchim as well. Let me clarify. After they burned copies of the Moreh Nevuchim, they burned copies of the Talmud. So, of course, the Ashkenazi rabbis were devastated by the fact that copies of the Gemara, copies of the Talmud were burned. While they might not have been as disturbed by the burning of the Moreh Nevuchim, a book that they themselves actually banned, although they didn't themselves burn or think that it was a good thing to burn, they were certainly devastated by the burning of the Talmud in France. And actually, a rabbi named Rabbeinu Yonah of Girona of Spain, in an area northern Spain. So Rabbeinu Yonah believed that the burning of the Talmud was actually a punishment for the way that the Ashkenazi rabbis treated the Rambam's works. And Rabbeinu Yonah wrote a sefer called Sharei Tshuva as an act of tshuva, an act of repentance in response to that. Finally, before we close up this video, the Rashba, Rabbeinu Shlomo ben Aderet, also put a ban on certain secular learning as well. It was a little after he was a little after the burning, or significantly after the burning of these texts, but not that much after. So he was also, again, this philosophy, this approach of, closing ourselves off from the world of learning outside of Torah, because that could be problematic. We'll continue with the Rambam, with the Moreh Nevuchim controversy, or the Maimonidean controversy, in the next video.